The Virgin Suicides by Eugenides. At 37, Gina de Sander had envisioned the hunk of masculinity latent in Tripp Fontaine's chubby, speedoed form, and during her week with him in Mexico, she chiseled him into the shape of a man. We could only imagine what went on in her hotel room, with Tripp drunk on spiked pineapple juice, watching Gina de Sander deal rapid fire in the middle of her stripped bed. The sliding door to the small concrete balcony had come off its track. Tripp, being the man, had tried to fix it. The dressers and bedside tables were littered with the detritus of last night's room party. Empty glasses, tropical swizzle sticks, washed-up orange rinds. With his vacation tan, Tripp must have looked much as he did in late summer, circulating in his swimming pool, his nipples like two pink cherries embedded in brown sugar. Gina de Sander's reddish, slightly creased skin flamed in age like leaves. Ace of hearts, 10 of clubs, 21, you win. She stroked his hair, dealt again. He never told any of us details, not even later when we were all adult enough to understand. But we looked on it as a wonderful initiation by a merciful mother, and though it remained a secret, the night conveyed on Tripp the mantle of a lover. When he returned, we heard his new deep voice sounding a foot above our heads, apprehended without understanding the tight seat of his jeans, smelled his cologne and compared our own cheese-colored skin to his. But his musky scent, the coconut oil smoothness of his face, the golden grains of intractable sand still glittering in his eyebrows, didn't affect us as it did the girls, who one by one, and then in groups, swooned. He received letters emblazoned with 10 different sets of lips, the lines of each pucker distinct as a fingerprint. He stopped studying for tests because of all the girls who came over to cram with him in bed. He spent his time keeping up his tan, floating on an air mattress around his bathtub-sized swimming pool. The girls were right in choosing to love Tripp because he was the only boy who could keep his mouth shut. By nature, Tripp Fontaine possessed the discretion of the world's great lovers, seducers greater than Casanova, because they didn't leave behind 12 volumes of memoirs, and we don't even know who they were. On the football field or naked in the locker room, Tripp Fontaine never spoke of the pieces of pie carefully wrapped in tinfoil that showed up inside his locker, nor of the hair ribbons gartered to his car antenna, nor even of the tennis sneaker dangling by one seamy lace from his rearview mirror, in the toe of which a sweaty note read, "The score is love. Love. Your serve, Tripp." The halls began to reverberate with his whispered name. While we called him the Trippster, or Fountainhead, the girls spoke only of Tripp. Tripp. That was the whole conversation. And when he was chosen best looking, best dressed, best personality, and best athlete, even though none of us had voted for him out of spite, and he wasn't even that coordinated, we realized the extent of the girls' infatuation. Even our own mothers spoke of his good looks, inviting him to stay for dinner, disregarding his longish, oily hair. Before long, he lived like a pasha, accepting tribute at the court of his synthetic coverlet. Small bills filched from others' purses, bags of dope, graduation rings, Rice Krispie treats wrapped in wax paper, vials of amyl nitrate, Asti Spumante bottles, assorted cheeses from the Netherlands, occasionally the odd chunk of hash. The girls came bearing typed and footnoted term papers, chick notes they had compiled so that Tripp could read a single page on each book. Over time, from the bounty of their offerings, he compiled his museum display of great reefers of the world, each sample house in an empty spice jar lined along his bookshelf, from blue Hawaiian to Panama red, with many stops and brownish territories between, one of which looked and smelled like carpet. We didn't know much about the girls who went to Tripp Fontaine's, only that they drove their own cars and always took in something from the trunk. They were the jangly earring type, with hair bleached at the fringes and cork-heeled shoes that tied around their ankles. Carrying salad bowls covered with printed dish towels, they walked bow-leggedly over the lawn, snapping gum and smiling. Upstairs in bed, they spoon-fed Tripp, wiping his mouth with the bedsheet before tossing the bowls onto the floor and melting in his arms. From time to time, Mr. Fontaine passed by on his way to or from Donald's room, but the iffiness of his own conduct prevented him from questioning the serrations coming from under his son's door. The two of them, father and son, lived like roommates, stumbling upon each other in their matching peacock robes, bitching over who used up the coffee. But by afternoon they drifted in the pool together, bumping the sides, compatriots in the search for a little passion on earth. They had the most lustrous father and son tans in the city. Even Italian contractors working in the sun day after day couldn't achieve their mahogany hue. At dusk, Mr. Fontaine's and Tripp's skins appeared almost bluish, and putting on their towel turbans, they looked like twin Krishnas. The small circular above-ground pool abutted the backyard fence, its swells sometimes dousing the neighbor's dog. Marinated in baby oil, Mr. Fontaine and Tripp boarded their air mattresses equipped with backrests and drink holders, and drifted beneath our tepid northern sky as though it were the Costa del Sol. We watched them, in stages, turning the color of shoe polish. We suspected Mr. Fontaine of lightening his hair, and the brightness of their teeth grew painful to look at. At parties, wild-eyed girls would clutch us just because we knew Tripp, and after a while we saw that they were as distraught at the hands of love as we were. Mark Peters, going out to his car one night, felt someone grab his leg. Looking down, he saw Sarah Sheed, who confessed she had such a huge crush on Tripp that she couldn't walk. He still remembers the panic-stricken way she looked up at him, a big, healthy girl renowned for her chest size, lying lame as a cripple in the dewy grass. No one knew how Tripp and Lux had met, or what they had said to each other, or whether the attraction was mutual. Even years later, Tripp was reticent on the subject, in accord with his vows of faithfulness to the 418 girls and women he had made love to during his long career. He would only tell us, "I've never gotten over that girl, man. Never." In the desert with the sheikhs, he had sickly-looking wads of yellow skin under his eyes, but the eyes themselves clearly looked back to a verdant time. Gradually, through incessant coaxing, and owing in large part to the recovering substance abuser's need to talk non-stop, we managed to cobble together the story of their love. It began on a day when Tripp Fontaine attended the wrong history class. During fifth period study hall, as was his custom, Tripp Fontaine had gone out to his car to smoke the marijuana he took as regularly as Peter Petrovich, the diabetic kid, took insulin. 3 times a day, Petrovich showed up at the nurse's office for his injections, always using the hypodermic needle himself. Like the most craven of junkies, though after shooting up he would play the concert piano in the auditorium with astounding artistry, as though insulin were the elixir of genius. Likewise, Tripp Fontaine went to his car 3 times a day, at 10:15, 12:15, and 3:15, as though he wore a wristwatch like Petrovich's that beeped at dose time. He always parked his Trans Am at the lot's far end facing the school to spot any approaching teachers. The car's raked hood, sleek roof, and sloping rear gave it the look of an aerodynamic scarab. Those signs of age had begun to mar its golden finish. Tripp had repainted the black racing stripes and shined the spiky hubcaps that looked like weapons. Inside, the leather bucket seats retained idiosyncratic perspiration marks. You could see where Mr. Fontaine had rested his head in traffic jams, the chemicals in his hairspray turning the brown leather a light purple. The faint aroma of his boots and saddle, air freshener, still clung to the air, though by that time the car was permeated more with the smell of Tripp's musk and reefer. The racing car doors, shut with a hermetic seal, and Tripp used to say you could get higher in this car than anywhere because you kept breathing in the captured smoke. Every juice break, lunch, and study hall, Tripp Fontaine sauntered out to his car and submerged himself in the steam bath. 15 minutes later, when he opened the door, the smoke would churn out as though from a chimney, dispersing and curling to the music, usually Pink Floyd or Yes, which Tripp kept playing as he went about checking his engine and polishing his hood, the ostensible reasons for his trips to the parking lot. After shutting up his car, Tripp walked behind the school to air out his clothes. He kept a spare box of mints hidden in the knothole of one memorial tree, planted for Samuel O. Hastings, graduate of the class of 1918. From classroom windows, girls watched him, out under the trees, alone and irresistible, sitting cross-legged like an Indian, and even before he got up, they could picture the light dirt stains on each buttock. It was always the same. Tripp Fontaine rose to full height, adjusted the frames of his aviator sunglasses, flipped back his hair, zipped the breast pocket of his brown leather jacket, and started forward on the juggernaut of his boots. He came down the corridor of memorial trees, across the black green, past the beds of ivy, and into the school's rear door. No boy was ever so cool and aloof. Fontaine gave off the sense of having graduated to the next stage of life, of having his hands thrust into the heart of the real world, whereas the rest of us were still memorizing quotations and grade grubbing. Though he retrieved his books from his locker, we knew that they were only props and that he was destined for capitalism and not scholarship, as his drug deals already augured. On that day he would always remember, however, a September afternoon when the leaves had just begun turning, Tripp Fontaine came in to see Mr. Woodhouse, the headmaster, approaching down the hall. Tripp was used to running into figures of authority while stoned, and told us he never suffered from paranoia. He couldn't explain why the sight of our headmaster, with his flood pants and canary-yellow socks, caused his pulse to rise, and a light sweat to break out on the back of his neck just then. Nevertheless, in one nonchalant motion, Tripp entered the nearest classroom to escape. He didn't notice a single face as he took a seat. He saw neither teacher nor students and was aware only of the heavenly light in the room, an orange glow from the autumnal foliage outside. The room seemed full of a sweet viscous liquid, a honey nearly light as air, which he breathed in. Time slowed down, and in his left ear the ringing of the cosmic ohm started up clear as a telephone. When we suggested these details had been laced with the same THC in his blood, Tripp Fontaine thrust a finger into the air, the only time his hand stopped shaking during the entire interview. "I know what it's like to be high," he said. "This was different." In the orange light, the students' heads looked like sea anemones, undulating quietly, and the silence of the room was that of the ocean floor. "Every second is eternal," Tripp told us, describing how, as he sat at his desk, the girl in front of him, for no apparent reason, had turned around and looked at him. He couldn't say she was beautiful because all he could see were her eyes. The rest of her face, the pulpy lips, the blonde sideburn fuzz, the nose with its candy-pink translucent nostrils, registered dimly as the two blue eyes lifted him on a sea wave and held him suspended. "She was the still point of the turning world," he told us, quoting Eliot, whose collected poems he had found on the shelf of the detoxification center. For the eternity that Lux Lisbon looked at him, Tripp Fontaine looked back, and the love he felt at that moment, truer than all subsequent loves because it never had to survive real life, still plagued him, even now in the desert with his looks and health wasted. "You never know what'll set the memory off," he told us. "A baby's face, a bell on a cat's collar, anything." They didn't exchange a single word, but in the weeks that followed, Tripp spent his days wandering the halls, hoping for Lux to appear, the most naked person with clothes on he had ever seen. Even in sensible school shoes, she shuffled as though barefoot, and the baggy apparel Mrs. Lisbon bought for her only increased her appeal, as though after undressing she had put on whatever was handy. In corduroys her thighs rubbed together, buzzing, and there was always at least one untidy marvel to unravel him, an untucked shirt tail, a sock with a hole, a ripped seam showing under arm hair. She guarded her books from class to class, but never opened them. Her pens and pencils looked as temporary as Cinderella's broom. When she smiled, her mouth showed too many teeth, but at night Tripp Fontaine dreamed of being bitten by each one. He didn't know the first step in pursuing her, because he'd always been the one pursued. Little by little, from the girls who came up to his bedroom, he learned where Lux lived, though he had to be discreet with his questions in order to avoid provoking their jealousy. He began driving by the Lisbon house in hopes of getting a glimpse of her, or the consolation prize of a sister. Unlike us, Tripp Fontaine never mixed up the Lisbon girls, but from the outset saw Lux as their shining pinnacle. He opened the windows of his Trans Am as he drove by, turning up his 8-track, hoping that she might hear his favorite song in her bedroom. Other times, unable to control the riot in his gut, he floored the accelerator, leaving behind as a love token only the smell of burning rubber. He didn't understand how she had bewitched him, nor why, having done so, she promptly forgot his existence. And in desperate moods he asked his mirror why the only girl he was crazy about was the only girl not crazy about him. For a long time he resorted to his time-tested methods of attracting girls, brushing his hair back as Lux passed, or clomping his boots up on the desktop, and once he even lowered his tinted glasses to give her the boon of his eyes. But she didn't look. The truth was, even the wimpiest boys were more adept than Tripp at asking girls out, because their sparrows' chests and knock-knees had taught them perseverance, whereas Tripp had never even had to dial a girl's phone number. It was all new to him. The memorization of strategic speeches, the trial runs of possible conversations, the yogic deep breathing, all leading up to the blind, headlong dive into the staticky sea of telephone lines. He hadn't suffered the eternity of the ring about to be picked up, didn't know the heart rush of hearing that incomparable voice suddenly linked with his own, the sense it gave of being too close to even see her, of actually being inside her ear. He had never felt the pain of lackluster responses, the dread of, "Oh, hi!" or the quick annihilation of, "Who?" His beauty had left him without cunning, and so, in despair, he confessed his passion to his father and Donald. They understood his predicament, and after calming him with a snifter of sambuca, gave him advice only 2 people experienced with the burden of secret love could have given. First of all, they told him, on no account to call Lux on the telephone. "It's all subtlety," Donald said. "It's all nuance." Rather than making overt declarations, they suggested that Tripp speak to Lux only about the most mundane things, the weather, school assignments, anything that gave him an opportunity to communicate with the silent but unerring language of eye contact. It made him get rid of his tinted lenses and keep his hair out of his face with hairspray. The next day, Tripp Fontaine took a seat in the science wing and waited for Lux to pass by on the way to her locker. The rising sun turned the honeycomb panels the color of a blush. Each time the ramp doors opened, Tripp saw Lux's face float forward, before her eyes, nose, and mouth rearranged into the face of some other girl. He took this as a bad omen, as though Lux were continually disguising herself in order to evade him. He feared she would never come, or, worse, that she would. After a week without seeing her, he decided to take extraordinary measures. The next Friday afternoon, he left his carrel in the science wing to go to assembly. It was the first assembly he had attended in 3 years, because skipping assembly was easier than skipping any other period, and Tripp preferred to spend the time smoking the hookah pipe running from his glove compartment. He had no idea where Lux would sit and lingered at the drinking fountain, intending to follow her in. Against the advice of his father and Donald, he put on sunglasses to conceal his staring down the hall. 3 times his heart jumped at the decoys of Lux's sisters, but Mr. Woodhouse had already introduced the day's speaker, a local television meteorologist, by the time Lux came out of the girls' bathroom. Tripp Fontaine saw her with a concentration so focused he ceased to exist. The world at that moment contained only Lux. A fuzzy aura surrounded her, a shimmering as of atoms breaking apart, brought on, we later decided, from so much blood draining out of Tripp's head. She passed right by him without noticing, and in that instant he smelled not cigarettes as he expected, but watermelon gum. He followed her into the colonial clarity of the auditorium, with its Monticello dome, Doric pilasters, and imitation gas lanterns we used to fill with milk. He sat next to her in the last row, and though he avoided looking at her, it was no use. With organs of sense he hadn't realized he possessed, Tripp Fontaine felt Lux beside him, registered her body temperature, heartbeat, respiration rate, all the pumping and flow of her body. The auditorium lights dimmed as the weatherman began showing slides, and soon they were in the dark together, alone despite 400 students and 45 teachers. Paralyzed by love, Tripp didn't move once as tornadoes flashed on the screen, and it was 15 minutes before he got up the courage to place a sliver of forearm along the armrest. Once he did, an inch of space still separated them. So over the next 20 minutes, with infinitesimal advances that made his whole body sweat, Tripp Fontaine moved his arm towards hers. As all other eyes watched Hurricane Zelda tear towards a coastal Caribbean town, the hairs on Tripp's arm brushed Lux's, and electricity surged through the new circuit. Without turning, without breathing, Lux responded with equal pressure. Then Tripp applied more, she responded, and so on until they were joined at the elbow. Right then it happened. A prankster in front cupping his hands over his mouth, making a farting noise, and the room rippled with laughter. Lux blanched, pulling her arm away, but Tripp Fontaine took the opportunity to whisper the first words he had ever spoken in her ear. "That must have been Conley," he said. "His ass is grass." In response, she didn't so much as nod, but Tripp, still leaning towards her, continued, "I'm going to ask your old man if I can take you out." "Fat chance," said Lux, not looking at him. The lights came up, and all around them students began clapping. Tripp waited for the applause to peak before he spoke again. Then he said, "First, I'm going to come over and watch the tube at your house. This Sunday. Then I'm going to ask you out." Again he waited for her to speak, but the only sign she'd heard came from her hand, which, turning palm up, suggested he could do what he liked. Tripp stood up to go, but before doing so leaned over the back of his vacated seat, as the words he'd been keeping down for weeks came pouring out. "You're a stone fox," he said, and took off.